fantastic. Okay, so the Hershey-Chase experiment was sort of the nail in the coffin. By the time Hershey and Chase are done with their experiment, everybody now accepts that it is indeed DNA and not protein, which is the genetic material for heredity. All right, so we are now on the section of the notes that says the role of DNA. I believe this should be the last page. And then when we are done with this, we will be done with the notes and we'll be able to move on from there. All right, so the role of DNA. DNA, it makes up genes and must be capable of storing, copying, and transmitting genetic information of a cell. Those are the three functions of DNA. Again, DNA has three roles. It has to store genetic information, it has to copy genetic information, and it must transmit genetic information. And sometimes we talk about DNA the way that we might talk about the way you might share a book, right? So that book holds information when the author creates it. We can then make copies of that book to distribute. And then, of course, that information can be then transmitted as more and more readers come into contact with it. So again, the three functions, the three roles of DNA are to, number one, store your genetic information. Number two, copy your genetic information. And finally, number three, transmit your genetic information. All right, so storing information. This is the primary job of DNA. If DNA can't do this, it's kind of like over with, all right? It is the molecule of heredity, and his primary job is to store information. Your genes, which are sections of your DNA code, control different patterns of development, which means that the instructions that cause a single cell to develop into a complex organism is written into your DNA. Your DNA basically is the instruction manual for you. If you have ever healed, like if you ever cut yourself and the cut has healed, if you have ever gotten cold and you started to shiver, if you ever developed a fever and started to sweat, if you've ever felt hungry, if you've ever felt tired, any of these things that cause you to do something is stored in your DNA. If you're hungry and then you eat and then you no longer feel hungry, your DNA has instructions for that. It says, oh man, we need nutrients. We better, send out that signal that says, hey, buddy, you need to eat. And then as soon as you eat enough, it sends a signal that says, hey, we're good. Every single function that you do, whether it is a conscious function or a subconscious function, that information is stored in your DNA. And one day in the future, many of you will pass that stored information to your children, to your offspring, much like your parents passed their information to you. All right, the secondary function of DNA is that it has to be able to copy itself. Remember, when we talked about meiosis, mitosis, before a cell can divide, I don't care if we're making body cells, I don't care if we're making sex cells, before a cell can divide, it has to be able to make a complete copy of every single one of its genes, similar to the way that we can copy a book. Okay? Regarding the experiments that we've talked about so far, we did know at this point, after the Griffin experiment, the McLeod experiment, and the Hershey-Chase experiment, we now know that DNA 100% is the molecule that carries this information, and we know it has to copy itself. But at this point, to many scientists, the most puzzling aspect is how could DNA be copied? So now, like all good experiments that they said in the video, even though now we know DNA is indeed the genetic material, now we need to know, okay, how does it do its job? We know it stores the information. We saw that evidence already, but we now know that it has to copy itself. So now we need to know something about how does that actually happen. Um, and in order to understand how it copies itself, we need to know a little bit more about the structure of DNA. Now, once we actually had discovered the structure of DNA, and this didn't happen until like the 60s, the copying mechanism was soon put forward. So we will be looking at how DNA copies itself further into this unit. But for right now, we just need to know that DNA, number one, has to store information. Number two, has to be able to somehow copy all of that information. And then what is the third function of DNA? The third function of DNA is to transmit information. So again, when a cell divides, the daughter cells receive a copy of the genetic information. So if you are reproducing asexually, you have just transmitted your genetic information to that next generation. Now, if you are a organism that reproduces sexually, obviously we know that you are only going to send half of your genetic information to your offspring. Very careful sorting for sexually reproducing organisms is important during the formation of reproductive cells in meiosis. Um, Again, we do have some genetic variation that happens in prophase 1, where we have crossing over. And then, of course, when the when the copied chromosomes, the homologous chromosomes line up in metaphase 1, there is that kind of random assortment. They sort of like they may or may not end up on one side of the equator or the other. That being said, during meiosis, we have to have very careful sorting of chromosomes, because if not, sometimes you have DNA loss, sometimes you have too much DNA that goes in, and these sort of mutations can and do cause genetic problems for offspring. Okay, next slide. All right. So, probably next week. I think tomorrow we'll just work on maybe a timeline of the history of DNA. But next week we'll be getting a little bit more into DNA and how does it work. So we're just gonna kind of do like a preview video here. If I can get it to work. There we go.
So let's say you have to read an incredibly long email from your boss that you have to finish before the big meeting starts in 10 minutes.
Stated Clearly presents What is DNA and how does it work? DNA, also known as deoxyribonucleic acid, is a molecule. It's a bunch of atoms stuck together. In the case of DNA, these atoms combine to form the shape of a long, spiraling ladder, sort of like this one here. If you ever studied biology or saw the movie Jurassic Park, you probably heard that DNA acts as a blueprint or a recipe for a living thing. But how? How on earth can a mere molecule act as a blueprint for something as complex and wonderful as a tree, a dog, or a dinosaur? To help answer that question, let's first take a quick look at amino acids. Amino acids are tiny little chemicals inside our bodies that are so important, they're often referred to as the building blocks of life. There's about 20 different kinds, each with their own unique shape. The neat thing about them is they can be attached to each other kind of like Legos to produce an endless variety of larger particles known as proteins. Amino acids make up proteins. Proteins, along with other chemicals, combine to form living cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. And organs, when they're all put together and functioning, of course, combine to form living creatures like you and me. These proteins that make up our bodies, and keep in mind there's millions of different kinds of proteins, they each have to be formed in the perfect shape in order to function. If they're the wrong shape, they usually won't work. That's where DNA comes in. DNA does a lot of interesting things, some of which we don't fully understand, but one of its main and most well understood functions is to tell amino acids how to line up and form themselves into the perfect protein shapes. In theory, if the right proteins are built at the right time and in the right place, everything else from cells to organs to entire creatures will come out just fine. This here is a simplified model of DNA. It shows us that the steps of the ladder are made up of 4 different kinds of chemicals shown here by different colors and letters. If you look at just one half of the molecule, you can read its chemical sequence or genetic code from top to bottom, sort of like a book. A single strand of DNA is extremely long, millions of letters long. It spends most of its life coiled up like a noodle, living inside the nucleus or the centerpiece of a cell. Amino acids, however, live outside the nucleus in what's called the cytoplasm. To help DNA interact with the cytoplasm and convert those amino acids into proteins, special chemicals inside the nucleus make partial copies of the DNA code. These partial copies, called RNA, look a lot like DNA, but they're shorter, of course, and they're missing one of their sides. Their small shape and size allows them to fit through tiny pores in the nucleus, out to the cytoplasm, and into the mouth of another particle called a ribosome. Ribosomes are protein-building machines. They read the RNA code 3 letters at a time, suck amino acids out of their surroundings, and stick them together in a chain according to the RNA code. As the chain grows, it bends, it folds, and it sticks to itself to form a perfectly shaped protein. Every 3 letters of the RNA code tell the ribosome which of the 20 different kinds of amino acids should be added next. For example, CAA tells the ribosome to grab a glutamine. AGU tells it to grab a serine, and so on. Once a protein is built, it can then go on to do a number of different things, one of which could be to help form a brand new cell. So to answer the original question, what is DNA? DNA is a molecular blueprint for a living thing. How does it work? DNA creates RNA, RNA creates protein, proteins go on to form life. This entire process, as complicated, as sophisticated, as magical as it might seem, is entirely based in chemistry. It can be studied, it can be understood. I'm John Perry, and that's DNA stated clearly.
All right. Ooh, thank you, Mr. John Perry. Okay, let me get